Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to the 35th annual Joseph and Edith Vogel lecture series, a lecture series endowed by Ezra Vogel, about whom I'll say a bit more in a moment, that each year brings together members of the Ohio Wesleyan community and our friends from the community of Delaware and surrounding areas to reflect on a bit of history from the town of Delaware or from Central Ohio. The first lecture was given in 1985 by Dick Smith. Professor Smith called my office today saying he had intended to be here but was unable to be here because of a minor health issue. Of course, we now have the Richard Smith Civil War lecture. Professor Smith's lecture topic in that first lecture was Delaware County politics through the Civil War. I call it the Smith lecture meets the Vogel lecture. Since then, the Vogel lecture is focused on the history and society of Central Ohio in a variety of ways and gives us the opportunity together, both as town and gown, as campus and community, to reflect on our shared history. The lecture was made possible by Ezra Vogel in memory of his parents, Joe and Edith Vogel, who were icons in the Delaware community, proprietors of the People's Store, and just good people in town. And I have had many people tell me about members of their family who found their way through the Depression because of the generosity of the Vogels and the credit that was extended to them at the People's Store. Ezra grew up in a house not far from the Ohio Wesleyan campus, about a block from the house in which Melissa and I live now. He attended schools here in Delaware, graduated from high school and came in 3 years, came to Ohio Wesleyan and finished in 3 years, off to Harvard where he completed his Ph.D. in sociology, and then after a brief time in the military, accepted a post at Yale, and by 1960 had found his way back to Harvard, where he remains to this day. Though he theoretically retired in 2000, he has been anything but retired in the years since. But what's remarkable to me about Ezra, and I'll say just a bit about his scholarship in a moment, what's most remarkable to me about him is the connection that he continues to feel to his hometown and to his home campus. And Ezra, we welcome you back to Delaware and to Ohio Wesleyan. Thank you for what you have done for our campus. I could spend the rest of the evening and cut well into the time of our distinguished guest by telling you all that Ezra has accomplished in his scholarship, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. His 1979 work, Japan as #1, Lessons for America, remains the all-time best-selling piece of nonfiction in Japan by a Western author. That's remarkable. And because Japan was not enough for him, he then moved his scholarship to China, and a few years ago authored the seminal biography of Deng Xiaoping. And when that work was complete, because his generosity extends not only to his friendships in Delaware and to his scholarship, but also to his passion for his alma mater, he assigned to Ohio Wesleyan the royalties for the Chinese translation of that biography. That is now a 7-figure endowment for Ohio Wesleyan that supports our students in travel primarily to East Asia, reflecting his commitment to ensuring that students of today and tomorrow have the opportunity to get to know that part of the world and to benefit from it as he has benefited from it as so much. So Ezra, thank you for your presence. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your understanding of the benefit of bringing the campus and the town together, and welcome home. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Flam from the Department of History, who will introduce our speaker for the Vogel Lecture.
Good evening. On behalf of the Ohio Wesleyan History Department, I am delighted to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Julie Moise. But first, I would also like to thank Professor Vogel, whose generosity made this lecture series possible, And I would like to publicly express our gratitude, our deepest gratitude, to Ms. Dawn Wright, our dedicated administrative assistant, who handled all the logistics surrounding this evening's event. Without her, this evening truly would have been impossible. So please join me in acknowledging her countless contributions with a round of applause. And now it is my great pleasure to present Dr. Julie Moise, who graduated with a Ph.D. in Civil War history. There's that Dick Smith connection again, Civil War history, from Kent State University in 2012. After teaching at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut for 4 years, she returned to Central Ohio, where she has taught at Capital University and Denison University. At the same time, she has joined the board of the Columbus Historical Society. She has organized several public history exhibits, which are terrific, and I encourage you to visit them if you can when you're down in Columbus. And she has created her own historical consulting company, which offers a wide range of services for businesses and institutions. The website is terrific. I encourage you to visit. Her entrepreneurial skills are remarkable. Finally, as if that was not enough, Dr. Moise is a prolific scholar who has published numerous reviews, articles, and essays on topics such as loyalty rhetoric, educational inequality, and student patriotism in the Civil War era. And Fordham University Press, I was delighted to learn, will soon publish her new book on, quote, "Why They Stayed the Mind of Northern Men in the Civil War Midwest." But tonight, she will discuss the challenges and the changes that Columbus veterans of the Great War encountered a century ago. And so without further ado, please join me in extending a warm Ohio Wesleyan welcome to Dr. Julie Moise.
Hi, good evening. Oops, that goes back up. Go back up and stay. How are you? Thank you for being here this evening. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Michael Flam for the invitation to speak before you, as well as Dr. Ezra Vogel, the Ohio Wesleyan History Department, and the members of Columbus Historical, I'm not even using that, the members of Columbus Historical Society's World War I exhibits. The members of Columbus Historical Society who are in the audience, as well as all of the new people that I met this evening in the reception and dinner. It's actually a really great idea to have a reception and dinner before a talk like this, because then I get to meet people and it feels much more homey, so that's great. As Dr. Flam said, I am a historian of the American Civil War. I've been asked many times why I've been sort of doing this circuit over the last year talking about World War I, and so I'll give you a little bit of background about that. But I'm here tonight in my capacity as program director and lead curator for Columbus Historical Society's World War I exhibits and events. So Civil War, World War I, when I joined the board of the Columbus Historical Society was the summer that the nation was being faced with the controversies and the riots regarding Confederate monuments. And so when we were sort of brainstorming what should come next for the Columbus Historical Society, I suggested, well, why don't we look at construction of memory for World War I? Were there riots regarding monuments related to World War I in Columbus? So what's happening about the way in which Columbus is remembering this war? So that's what we put together. I've been a part of a great team at Columbus Historical Society that has, for the past 18 months, been seeking and sharing World War I memory with Columbus residents. We've put together 9 new exhibits at our museum and 7 events that come together in a program called We Shall Remember Them: How Columbus Remembered the Great War. And like I said, it was an effort to think about how World War I memory has been constructed and how this war has been commemorated in the Columbus community in the 100 years since the armistice. Thanks to a grant from Ohio Humanities Council and generous corporate sponsorships, we have really succeeded in expanding community knowledge about the ways in which World War I left a lasting impression in this region. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you tonight about how World War I veterans in particular experienced life in Central Ohio after the war. My goal is to paint a picture for you of some of the events and organizations that shaped their lives in this post-war era. But I want to begin first with this image, which Dr. Flam knows is my favorite. This World War I soldier who's on the cover of Jeffrey Service magazine. This is a magazine that was published monthly by Jeffrey Manufacturing Company in Columbus. I'll be speaking more about that company later this evening. But just looking at this image, it makes me think about what was this veteran thinking? He's dressed in his work clothes with his lunchbox. He's getting ready to go back to work for the first time. He's sort of looking down at his military uniform, and the look on his face I can't quite figure out. Is he excited? Is he nostalgic? Is he nervous? Does he miss being in the military? Is he excited to go back to work? I'm not sure. But every time I look at it, I think this is really what I was trying to capture, was this transition, this adjustment, and how these soldiers made their way through this, this major change in their lives back to their civilian lives. This image does show us more about what Columbus leaders and frankly national leaders hoped that veterans would do as opposed to what really happened. Transitioning home was not always as easy as this photo would like us to believe. After World War I, about 4 million soldiers returned to the United States from Europe. Nearly 200,000 of those returned to Ohio. Ohio soldiers served largely in a few notable divisions, including one called the Buckeye Division, and others as a part of the famous Rainbow Division, which were National Guard units from across the nation brought together into one group. There was also the 83rd Division, which absorbed most Ohio draftees, and the 372nd Colored Infantry Regiment, which was the segregated unit that Ohio's African-American soldiers could join. In total, only New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois sent more soldiers than did Ohio. And nearly 15,000 of the 225,000 from this state were from Franklin County. At that time, Columbus was passing the 200,000 mark in population and would reach 237,000 people by the 1920 census. Indeed, as you can see, this was a decade of tremendous growth. Because the United States was not involved in World War I that long, soldiers who enlisted or drafted had a range of experience. Some soldiers never made it out of training camp. They never left US soil. Many of the soldiers did get to Europe, but had not been gone that long. Some arrived in Europe just in time to have the war end, and then had to participate in supply or occupation detail for months, waiting to come home. Their letters, I will tell you, are filled with frustration and angst about the long delays in returning back to this side of the pond. They did not find it amusing at all that demobilization had not really been planned by the US government. Other Ohio soldiers fought bravely in multiple battles with their divisions, and a number returned home with severe wounds and disabilities, not to mention the nearly 300 from the county who never returned back to their families. What I want to emphasize is that World War I soldiers had a variety of experiences. This is no different than soldiers in any other war. Some enlisted, some were drafted, some faced combat, others did not. The one thing they had in common, however, was that when they returned home, those who did return home, they had to figure out how to move forward. What would that look like? The first soldiers returned to Columbus in February of 1919 and continued to do so until May of that same year, including parades like this one that were held for the armistice. Columbus actually threw 2 parades for the armistice, one a few days earlier when they thought the war had ended. That was like a fake parade, but they still had fun. And then an actual parade on Armistice Day. In addition to those 2, Columbus threw a total of 7 parades during this demobilization process, one for every regiment that returned to the city. Many businesses closed for these events, and classes at Ohio State University were routinely canceled so that students, faculty, and staff could participate, often because these parades were going right by where they were anyway. No matter the weather, Columbus residents made these soldiers feel welcomed and appreciated. This response extended to the city's African-American soldiers as well. Historians have outlined the ways in which service in Europe changed African Americans. These men experienced the notion of freedom in new ways and grew hopeful that their participation and sacrifice would be honored with increased equality, back here in the United States. They saw that people with their skin color were not subject to Jim Crow segregation in places like France, and they felt freedom over there in different ways. They use those words, that they felt freedom differently when they were in Europe. Ways that triggered their imaginations and the realization of how significant their oppression was in the States. Furthermore, the US Army had not been welcoming to them at all, and black soldiers faced crushing repression in the ranks, some even more so than in their daily lives. Specifically, what I'll mention here is that college-educated African Americans who went over in officer positions were routinely tormented and demoted and sent into work that they did not anticipate when they got there. The parades, though, helped these black soldiers believe that what they had put up with would be worth it, that the vileness of their military experience would be rewarded at home. These parades, especially like this one in Columbus, also reflected the impact of war-era migration from the South. We were talking at dinner about migration between parts of this country, and during this period of time, during World War I, a lot of African Americans migrated up from the South to look for work in the North. In Ohio, most blacks who arrived from the South in search of industrial work settled in Cincinnati or Cleveland. However, Columbus's black population also surged during the war, and the parade was recognition of the presence of their population here. When soldiers came home in 1919, they would have noticed a few key differences very quickly. While anti-German sentiment was not that strong in Columbus as it was in other parts of Ohio and across the nation, even still, Columbus City Council was swept up in this. There were a number of significant changes for German Americans during this period of time. The one in Columbus that still makes most people chuckle is when Schiller Park was changed to Washington Park in May of 1918 by order of City Council. And if you come to the exhibits, we have this postcard, which is a rustic bridge in Washington Park in Columbus, Ohio, but we have the exact same postcard with it called Schiller Park before the war. It's a black and white photo, but it's of the same scene. They actually changed the name of the park back to Schiller Park in April of 1930. So that one wouldn't have been different for very long. However, there were 4 street names in Columbus that were changed permanently. The City Council changed Kaiser Street to Gear Street, which eventually became Lear Street in 1931. They also changed Germania Street to Stewart Avenue. They changed Bismarck Street to Lansing Street and Schiller Street to Whittier Street. I don't expect you to remember any of those. But what I do want to make clear is that if you go through what is now the core of Columbus's German village, you'll still see a number of streets that have German names, right? Those were more so in reference to German Americans who lived in Columbus and who were leaders in the community at that time or in prior generations. So these were people who had streets named after them in honor of the contributions they had made to the community. So City Council wasn't foolish enough to change those names. They changed the ones that seemed most German to them. Like, let's change Germania Street, sure, or Bismarck Street. That's understandable. So a lot of the German parts of Columbus's history were left untouched. This is not what happened in a lot of other places in the country, so it was different for veterans to come home to a Columbus that still had quite a bit of Germanic background. Veterans also faced an end-of-war housing shortage when they arrived, which led to a rise in housing costs. This was mainly due to increased migration to the city during the war, both from the South and from the surrounding countryside. They would have also noticed when they arrived home the essence of a new community spirit, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, but Columbus was the second city in the nation to complete and surpass its goal in the 4th Liberty Loan Drive in the summer of 1918. And this is a structure called the Memorial Arch, which was built temporarily at the intersection of Broad and High, and it kept track of the loan amounts that Columbus residents donated during this loan drive. And Columbus, the community was extremely proud of this achievement, and but were feeling their importance very greatly by the time that the summer of 1919 came around. Not only that, but President Wilson followed the soldier parades by kicking off his Treaty of Versailles tour in Columbus. When President Wilson wanted Americans, specifically Congress, but he couldn't get their support, so he had to go after the people, when they wanted, he wanted them to support the treaty and also the League of Nations, he went on this massive tour throughout the United States. He didn't make it all the way through, right, because he had a stroke, but Columbus was his first stop. So the city was feeling a boost in national prominence, which veterans would have also felt in the excitement of that moment. By the time that Wilson arrived in Columbus that fall, however, it was becoming clear that one issue veterans would have to deal with was the terms of their benefits. So this is where my Civil War comes back, okay? There was a lot of pressure on World War I veterans not to act like Civil War veterans. Not to demand financial support, not to be a burden on the nation, not to demand medical benefits. Civil War veterans had, for the last 50 years, been able to command benefits which cost the federal government more than 1/5 of its total revenue, including an all expenses paid reunion every year that was held through the 1940s. By 1916, the United States had spent over $5 billion on Civil War pensions, an amount that exceeded the cost of the war itself. And they were still, at the time the World War I soldiers left for Europe, they were still paying over $200 million annually. They had extended Civil War benefits in the late 1890s to cover old age, even when it wasn't a disability that was related to the war. These guys were just getting older. To progressive era reformers, progressive era being the time period in which sort of World War I butts up against, Civil War veterans threatened the moral fabric of the country because they were not rehabilitated men who were supporting their families and contributing to the work of society. In their eyes, even 50 years later, these Civil War veterans just took and gave nothing back. Progressive reformers wanted World War I veterans to rehabilitate in order to work again and to be breadwinners. This concept was important to progressive reformers to reinforce traditional domestic notions of male and female roles in the household. Reformers wanted veterans programs to focus on rehabilitation, including medical care and vocational training, in order to reduce and potentially erase cash payments that would be made to dependent veterans. They believed that veterans should make a speedy return to work, rely on their own wage-earning capacity rather than on government pensions. They wanted disabled men to be refitted with prosthetic limbs and be retrained for a new workplace and a new job if what they had been doing wouldn't work in their new physical situation. So the Wilson administration sort of absorbed all of this progressive rhetoric, and because Wilson really didn't want to deal with this, he desperately wanted to handle the political situation with the treaty, he just sort of said, okay, you know what? Another one of the great progressive inventions is the workers' compensation laws, workers' comp laws. And so he thought they could reformulate veterans' benefits by using new workmen's comp laws as the model. So what the government did was it took veteran pensions out of the hands of the Pension Bureau, which was managing Civil War pensions, and it created something called the War Risk Insurance Bureau. And the War Risk Insurance Bureau was originally designed to insure the loss of ships. But they decided that it could also provide insurance against damage to the bodies of soldiers that were sent into war. So this bureau served veterans in 4 areas: family payments for when the soldier was away for supporting the family. The second area is life insurance. Third, disability payments for those with service-connected conditions. And the fourth was long-term hospitalization for disabled veterans. So the way that these worked was that the soldiers were paid a certain amount to serve, and then they had deductions, just like we pay for health insurance or life insurance or whatever. They had one deduction come out of their paycheck while they were serving to go to their parent, to go to their family, to their wife, and to their children. Then they had another deduction come out of their paycheck to go toward their life insurance amount. Then they had another month, we have laughing here. Okay, so then we had another deduction come out towards disability insurance. So you had all of these disability payments, if you were disabled, that came out depending on the severity of your injury and the structure of your family. So you received more if you had a wife based on how many kids. All of this was like a sliding scale. So disabled veterans, when they returned home, begin to fight back against this rehabilitation ideal, right? This idea that the government put in place said that after 6 months of medical care, that disabilities would disappear, and that wounded soldiers would once again function as able-bodied men collecting a paycheck and off the government dole. One of the first ways that this new version of post-war veteran assistance was expressed was through the Veterans Rehabilitation Act, which passed in June of 1918, even before the armistice. This act provided educational aid for soldiers suffering disabling wounds during the war. It also gave them this education or vocational training in order to switch careers if what they were doing formerly wouldn't work for them anymore. And it gave them this very long sort of instructional manual on how to be a veteran. Okay? So, on page 10 of this lengthy pamphlet, it specifically addressed rehabilitation for disabled veterans, and I'd like to share with you briefly what it said. Quote, "If you have come back with a gold stripe on your right sleeve, or if you have been discharged because of disease or disability incurred in the line of duty before you had a chance to go overseas, the government will give you the best of care. In the Army hospital, you will receive special medical care, including what is called occupational treatment, which will both help you get well and give you training which will improve your chances for the future. If you have lost an arm or leg, a temporary artificial limb will be furnished while you are in the hospital. Later, the government will provide you free with a permanent artificial limb of the most modern type. You yourself will select this limb, and with the help and advice of a skilled surgeon. The artificial limb will be kept in repair at government expense and replaced when worn out." Now, all that sounds pretty good. It then continues to outline how disabled veterans with these fixes could access educational opportunities and vocational training so that they can, again, get a job and pick up right where they left off. Unlike Civil War veterans who were told to go home, convalesce, hang out, sit in the rocking chair, we'll pay for you for the rest of your life, that's not what these veterans in World War I heard. They were told to take their prosthetic limb, go learn a trade that would support their family despite their disability, both for their own good and also for that of the nation. But these educational and vocational training opportunities did not exist for veterans who were not disabled. They did not receive any readjustment services or career counseling, okay? So the only benefits that veterans received were for people who were disabled. Everyone else was sort of on their own. Not sort of, they were. When the American Legion, which we'll talk about more in a minute, took up advocacy during the 1920s to expand benefits for veterans, they mainly focused on the backlog of disabled claims and the demand from veterans that Congress retroactively reimburse their wartime pay. Their contention was that the military's low wages, minus all of the mandatory withholdings for the various insurances, left them with compensation, and this is the key, much lower than the inflated wartime wages of men who had stayed at home and worked. Thus, veterans argued they missed out on a significant earnings while serving their country. So this is the bonus that you hear so much about, right? They wanted this bonus to make up for the gap between what they earned serving and what they could have earned if they would have stayed home and worked in these very wealthy industrial jobs, or wealth-generating industrial jobs, if you will. While veterans advocacy groups sought to fight for these adjustments, healthy and disabled veterans struggled to readjust to new American economic and social realities. So where there was some confusion and frustration on the part of veterans about their federal benefits, universities, businesses, and churches tried to close the gap, not only economically, but also in emotional support. And this shouldn't really surprise you, because by the time we get to the Great Depression, that's what's happening there too, is charities, churches, businesses, universities are doing the charity. Many disabled veterans enrolled at Ohio State University as a consequence of the Veterans Rehabilitation Act. They began enrolling students in January of 1919, and by that summer, 250 veterans had enrolled, mostly into the agricultural program. This was a 50% jump in enrollment from the prior fall, And that number went up several hundred more students that next spring. So in response, more buildings were constructed, more teachers were hired, and the programs were expanded. And what you have at this point is a university that by 1935 looked much different than it did in 1917. I want you to just for a second make sure you know where the football stadium is at the top of the picture. It will be very important in a few minutes. It's so warm in here. I don't know, can we open that door? Sorry, I'm just watching everyone fan themselves and I'm feeling like I definitely feel that too. Okay, thank you. So Ohio State also recruited veterans who were not rehabilitating. For example, a gentleman by the name of Russell Coffey enlisted in the Army while a student at Ohio State and then returned to obtain 2 degrees following the war. Coffey held the distinction of being the oldest living World War I veteran. He was an Ohio State graduate until his death in 2003. Ohio State also assisted veterans with job placement, and these actions now foreshadow the boost that colleges and universities would give later in the century, but this was sort of a good initial run-through for universities to see how could they expand to absorb these large veteran populations that were coming back into their communities. Companies also took part in welcoming soldiers back and in creating a city moving forward with them. One example is the Jeffrey Manufacturing Company, which I mentioned in the opening slide. So Joseph A. Jeffrey was the creator of the world's first coal mining machine in 1877. And Jeffrey Manufacturing became the world's largest manufacturer of mining equipment. So by the time World War I came around, it was a flourishing, large manufacturing area in Columbus in what is now Italian Village. And Jeffrey Company actually sent about 400 men over in World War I in what was called Battery B. It was the 136th Artillery Regiment of the 37th Division. And so you had 400 men from Jeffrey Manufacturing Company leaving together and going in a regiment together over to World War I. In January of 1919, on his 83rd birthday, so this is before the soldiers started to come home, Joseph A. Jeffrey was honored at a dinner at the Columbus Club. Judge John E. Sater, who was a close friend of Mr. Jeffrey's, rose to speak on his behalf. And among his comments, he said this, quote, "The past 15 years have witnessed a great economic and sociological change, which has left its deep impress in many ways. There has been a keen nationwide realization of the fact that in a high sense, each man is in fact his brother's keeper. While this broadened feeling of charity and brotherhood was still active, came the declaration of war against Germany. No event has contributed so much towards enabling Columbus to find itself as this war, from which we have not yet wholly emerged. Had anyone predicted 2 years ago that this city could and would raise $75 million for any cause or any number of causes, however worthy, he would have been regarded as an extravagant dreamer." Well, clearly Mr. Jeffrey must have been an extravagant dreamer then, because Sater finished this talk up and announced that the businessman was giving 1,000 shares of preferred stock of Jeffrey Manufacturing Company, the value of which was $100,000. I really didn't mean to make a stir. Thanks. That's beautiful. Love it. Okay, so the value of these 1,000 shares was $100,000, which would provide the city annually with about $6,000 to be used for benevolent causes across the city and the county. Later, his wife gave an additional 2,500 more shares to the endowment, increasing the value to $350,000. By the turn of the 21st century, the fund's assets were over $3 million, and it is now administered through the Columbus Foundation. If anyone wants to plant roses anywhere, this is the fund you apply to. It is still flourishing and one of the Columbus Foundation's key funds. I want to point out again that Judge Sater recognized how World War I had changed Columbus. He said, quote, "No event has contributed so much towards enabling Columbus to find itself as the war." Businessmen like Joseph Jeffrey recognized that and bet on the ability of that wartime spirit to continue to infuse the city. And this was the home that Battery B, these 400 Jeffrey men, came home to that spring. Here they participated in parades like the one that you see on the May 1919 cover of Jeffrey's service. There were also special picnics for them and their families. There were extra benefits, ice cream socials. I mean, really, these guys were very much so welcomed and made to feel very special by the Jeffrey Company when they returned. We also have evidence of companies such as Buckeye Steel Castings, which was recently torn down in Columbus, honoring their veteran employees. I rescued a plaque, a World War I plaque from a warehouse in Cleveland, where the liquidator of Buckeye Steel Castings had whisked it away under our very noses. And companies continue to recruit veterans throughout Columbus. Churches like Broad Street Presbyterian Church dedicated monuments to their members who served in the war. And so you have this sort of blend of personal and professional care given to the veterans throughout most of the 1920s. And Columbus veterans begin to blend in with the community a little bit as you move through this era. Now, they still participated in various aspects of commemoration of World War I. They were a part of Armistice Days parades every year. They also participated in the dedication of statues and plaques and monuments in and around Columbus. And throughout the interwar period, veterans were honored and held up as positive role models. This was an ad I found for Buckeye State Building and Loan. By the way, the Columbus Historical Society has an amazing archive of original newspapers in the basement. I probably shouldn't tell you they're in the basement. They're in the basement. They're really awesome. And if you go down there, you can just find anything. The papers go from the late 1800s until the late 1900s. And so it's a treasure trove whenever you need something. So this particular ad for Buckeye State Building and Loan was in a Columbus Citizen from 1930. And it goes through this whole thing about, you know, people who have carried on and people who have lost their lives. But the interesting thing I wanted to get to was in the second column, where they said, they write, have you accomplished as much during the past 12 years as America's warriors who fought, right, in the 12 years since the war had ended? Are you, like the soldier boys fighting in France, assured of food and clothing only, nothing ahead financially? Why don't you save your money? You need to save your money, and mostly with us. Here's two more images, also from a 1930 newspaper, one from the Ohio National Bank, talking about all of the response to the Armistice Day that was coming up. And here is a cartoon from the Columbus Citizen. Today, a salute for those who did not return. So even 12 years later, the soldiers could open a newspaper and see that their impact in Columbus was being felt, that they were being recognized, that they were being seen, that their sacrifice and their contributions were a part of the narrative of what was happening in Columbus, even in the middle of, well, even in 1930, which I'll get to in a minute. So veterans associations also aided the readjustment of World War I veterans back to Columbus. And I'm going to focus tonight mainly on American Legion, which was created from the First World War. There were, of course, other veterans organizations that these guys could choose from. There was the Veterans of Foreign Wars, which traced its origins to the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. There was also the Disabled American Veterans of World War, which began in Cincinnati and had members in Columbus. But none of these groups really attracted World War I veterans right when they returned as much as the American Legion did. The American Legion was formed in Paris in March of 1919, before demobilization home. I will note, however, that by 1929, so about 10 years later, the American Legion was actually rather conservative in its advocacy and seemed to focus on trying to keep veterans from not being too large of a burden. And so they had become too conservative, and many World War I veterans in the 30s started to move over to VFW. But initially, American Legion really was the main draw. And by about 1930 or so, so within a decade, you could see veterans in Columbus and around the nation ascend to positions of power in politics, very influential members of Congress and the Senate and the Ohio legislature. And these politicians gained their chops, if you will, or they developed these skills through these vibrant veterans organizations. If you think about it, in the interwar period between World War I and II, there were 7 presidential elections. And so this soldier vote, the World War I soldier vote, was deemed very crucial. This allowed World War I soldiers to successfully advocate for increased rights beyond what Wilson and the progressives had initially designed for them. So the American Legion comes back from Paris, sets up, begins to bring soldiers into their posts. And by the end of 1919, Franklin County had 8 American Legion posts. Franklin Post 1 became the flagship of American Legion. That's not Franklin Post 1, it's just an American Legion slide. Its members became community leaders, which strengthened its role in the region. Because of this early activism and leadership, Franklin Post 1 is still in existence today, and they also supported our exhibits with loans of artifacts, which we appreciated very much. Veteran activity in Columbus after the war centered on Memorial Hall, which is the building you see there. And if any of you were at the November 11th closing address, it was held in Memorial Hall, which was very meaningful to me and I believe to Columbus Historical Society. It was really cool to have it there. This Memorial Hall is located on East Broad Street, and the American Legion met there. It's where President Wilson spoke when he came to town. They also ran charity functions for the public out of its halls during the Great Depression, and it served as a ration center for tires and gasoline during World War II. In 1952, the Franklin County Board of Trustees approved a $3 million project to construct a new building on West Broad Street called the Franklin County Veterans Memorial Building. It was dedicated on Veterans Day in 1955, 1 year after the name of Armistice Day had been changed to Veterans Day per a congressional measure, thus beginning the erasure of World War I memory, but we'll get to that. When back in Columbus, veterans would have found in the American Legion an organization that did not use military rank to describe members in their meetings, and they pushed newspaper and media outlets not to do so either. The American Legion was determined to foster equality among its members, and they used the language instead of comrade, which, on a side note, my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, told me when we did his Veterans History Project oral interview that he didn't want to join any of the veterans associations when he got back from, he served in both Europe and Asia, and he didn't want to join because he thought that the comrade language sounded too much like communism to him. I think though, honestly, the more I read about the American Legion and VFW, and I'll read you a passage at the end, I think he was just introverted and didn't want to hang out that much. Because American Legion really likes to socialize. Like, they like to be friends and be friendly. And even to when he passed away in November, he just wanted to be in his house by himself. So I think it was a whole lot of things. So it was interesting because the American Legion, however, believed that this approach to equality was important to keep soldiers from embracing radical ideas like socialism in an attempt to gain some sort of leverage over their superiors. American Legion also refused to participate directly in electoral politics, rather focusing on the policies that they supported instead of the politicians. For example, a municipal court judge in Franklin County by the name of Fred Miller was up for re-election in 1929 and published an advertisement claiming the endorsement of the American Legion, which he was then forced to retract because they would not stand for him claiming endorsement of any individual running for office. In the 1930s, Columbus's American Legion also condemned a German-American branch of the Nazi Party that had formed in Ohio, and they felt that it was a threat to American security and patriotism, and so spoke out very strongly against that development. In World War II, the Columbus Legion posts ran, oh, hold on, this is one I made that up, but okay, I'll get there in a second. They ran a jalopy drive to collect scrap metal, but they were sometimes overzealous in finding abandoned cars, causing some owners to post signs on their older vehicles like this one, "Do not collect for scrap, I'm still driving it." In an American Legion history, they have this whole story of how members were going around up and down streets and sort of taking things that they thought would work for this scrap metal collection. Other war efforts included fundraising events such as boxing tournaments, soap car derbies, cat shows, dog shows, horse shows, gun shows, jamborees, rodeos, charity auctions, plays to see who could raise the most money, and a number of different competitions related to war bonds. So they really did try to make it a fun, social, in the community affair. The American Legion in Columbus also became concerned after World War II with the image of American veterans. They wanted the public vision of servicemen to be positive, and they were concerned that media coverage of veterans who happened to break the law was not coming off the right way. So, for example, Columbus Posts were frustrated with local newspapers who would use the term veteran as a designation to describe someone who had committed a crime. So one headline that I found as an example that they were upset about was, quote, "Father slain by vet." Okay? Father slain by vet. They wanted it to just have his name. Like, don't associate the crime with that person being a veteran. And so in 1946, as World War II veterans started to return, the Franklin County Council of American Legion published a resolution requesting that local newspapers use only the name of the individual when the news was negative, and refer to the person as a veteran only when sharing good news. As the Legion entered into this new era of caring for veterans, they wanted to start off on the best possible foot, apparently, including telling newspapers how and when to use the designation of veterans. Veterans from World War II came home with the option of joining American Legion posts that had been created after World War I. So imagine, American Legion is created after World War I. Everyone in Columbus who's a veteran can decide whether or not to join it. World War II veterans come home, and they pretty much just choose from what's already there. I want to highlight two posts in particular, one because it ties to the Civil War, and the other because it brings me back again to the Jeffrey Company, which, if you haven't noticed, I really like, and I can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. The first is the American Legion Camp Chase Post 98, which is signified, I'll talk about that in a second, on the right-hand side of your screen. Camp Chase had been a Civil War military staging location in Columbus. It was also a prison camp. It was created in 1861 on West Broad Street, and about 150,000 Union soldiers passed through its gates during the Civil War. But it also detained about 25,000 Confederate prisoners during the war, right here in Columbus. Thousands of Confederate prisoners died at Camp Chase, and 2,260 are buried there. So we have over 2,000 Confederate prisoners buried in Columbus. When the war ended in 1865, the camp was closed and the buildings dismantled. The Legion Post was organized in April of 1929 when some West Side Columbus veterans wanted to have their own post. This post is unique because it is dedicated to all service members who have fought in all wars. Even in the late 1950s, the post had over 600 members. This is one of the only posts of the American Legion that also embraces the Civil War. When so many others sought to distance themselves from that generation, this particular post sort of ran with that. A second post I'd like to mention is the Malcolm D. Jeffrey Post 465. The top and the bottom will relate to that. This was organized in December 6th, 1933, started with 175 members. Malcolm Jeffrey was Joseph Jeffrey's son, served in the Army during World War I with his brother Walter. He commanded the unit, this Battery B, that came from his father's employees. In 1920, after the war, Malcolm became a strong advocate for the Legion as an increasingly important businessman in Columbus, but he died at age 46 in 1930. His home in Bexley, which is the bottom left picture, is now known as the Jeffrey Mansion and serves as the governor's home. Mike DeWine has moved in, and I think is starting repairs. The Legion Post was organized 3 years after Jeffrey's death as a tribute, and was made up exclusively of Jeffrey manufacturing employees. What I think is really interesting about this particular post is that it was near enough to all of the Jeffrey manufacturing facilities that the men could go after work and walk or drive to the Jeffrey Post. However, it wasn't close enough for them to go there on their lunch hour. So they kept it a little bit separated so it wasn't too much of a temptation. For over 30 years, nearly all veterans who worked at Jeffrey Manufacturing were members of that post. The post is still open, but all of the Jeffrey Manufacturing plants have since shut down. Memory, though, of the company's World War I regiment is kept alive through recent development of high-end apartments in that same area named for Battery B. It is important to note also that Black veterans were shut out of these organizations across the nation altogether. Most African American veterans after World War I turned to the NAACP as a way to advocate for their rights and benefits related to their military service. There were 2 organizations that formed to support veterans in their struggle for ending racial discrimination. They were called the Grand Army of Americans and the League for Democracy. I did not, however, find evidence of either of these in Columbus. If you know of it, please let me know. Upon their return, Black veterans in Columbus supported an Ohio House Bill 139, which sought to end segregation in public places. They were really hoping that after serving and showing that they were willing to sacrifice their lives for this nation, that they would be able to leverage that to get the end of segregation in public places. However, they quickly realized that they were mistaken, and the bill was defeated 35-16 in the Ohio legislature. We did not find in our research a tremendous amount of violence aimed at Columbus's Black population in the immediate aftermath of the war. Unlike many American cities that saw an uptick in lynchings, especially of Black veterans, our research did not find that in Columbus. 2 Black Baptist churches in Columbus, the Second Baptist and Mount Olivet, showed in the 1920s and 30s a tremendous growth and security among their parishioners. We have more work to do on this history, but the Historical Society is partnering with both of these organizations, these churches, in the coming months to explore these questions. What I have noticed when reading Columbus history is that quite a bit happened here in the 1920s and 30s, and sometimes I wonder where the Great Depression was. One of the most notable events in the Great Depression era related to World War I veterans was the Bonus March, which seems to have just passed Columbus by. In 1924, Congress awarded World War I veterans adjusted compensation for their wartime service. Remember I mentioned the compensation they wanted to adjust for what they didn't have for when they would have been here, okay? That was given to them in the form of an interest-bearing certificate payable in 1945. This was in 1924. The best they could do was take loans on it, like against it, so that they could have some of it in the more short term. In 1932, at the height of the Depression, veterans demanded immediate payment of their bonus, but the United States Congress refused. And a group of veterans from Portland, Oregon, headed to Washington, D.C. Your left, Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C. And along the way, they just sort of gathered more and more World War I veterans as they headed to Washington, D.C. Somehow, when they went through Columbus, there weren't people who went with them. More than 40,000 showed up in D.C. to demand compensation, but they were eventually forcibly removed from their encampments in D.C. and sent away with nothing, and their encampments were actually burned down. I think this would make a great project for a senior thesis, is what happened in Columbus around the time of the Bonus March, because, as I said, we have not come up with it. So if Columbus veterans were not marching for their bonus during the Great Depression, what were they doing? Well, I can tell you they were living in a city that was growing. During the Great Depression, Columbus grew by 15.5%. While cities in Ohio like Cleveland, Toledo, Akron, Youngstown, and Lorain all lost population. In 1930, Columbus's population was almost 300,000. Most historians believe that Columbus's growth was due to an influx of government workers required to administer extensive new social and economic programs in the rest of the state. So again, being this like state government hub helped us through the Great Depression. I think that these new residents would have felt somehow like how I felt when I moved here in 2016. I was fleeing a troubled economy in Connecticut, where we were told to drive on roads and bridges at our own risk, and we were told that Hartford was going to be the next Detroit. And so I happily moved here to Columbus, where there was hope, vibrancy, and excitement. I'm not sure I can classify the mood in Columbus during the Great Depression as vibrant and exciting. Maybe that's going a step too far, but new people moving here would have been able to quickly take stock of what was important in this town. So I want to show you a few things just to give you some visual images of what was happening here during the Depression. Now, in Columbus newspapers during the Great Depression, there were clearly signs that there were struggling businesses. You have another building and loan company that's talking about aid during unemployment and the ways in which they can help the community. A man who owns his own home is one of the most respected men in his community. Land is the basis of all wealth. Okay, very strong messages in a time when some people might struggle to meet that sort of standard. 2 on the left, announcements of closing. I will say, however, that Katz Bryce clothing store, the week they quit for about 3 or 4 more months. This dragged out for a while. It's like one of those foreclosure stores at a furniture place that never really seems to go all the way through. So it was clear that there was some struggle happening. But there were also ways that the war was still present and that companies were trying to capitalize on what was happening with the Great Depression. So I included this image about this play because the War Spy play was specifically about World War I. It was like a World War I drama, which I thought would have kind of been interesting to veterans living in Columbus at that time. And then this ad from the Ohio Bell Telephone Company, you probably can't read it, but I wanted to include the whole thing, but I'm going to read it to you. It says, "The working man or woman often experiences layoffs and dull times." Yes, we all know that. "Many people will tell you that having a telephone at home has a lot to do with keeping up their income. When work picks up after a layoff, the man or woman who can be reached quickest, and that means the one with the telephone, always gets the first call. Women who work by the day say that their telephone, as opposed to the night, I don't know, say that their telephone keeps them in work because those who want them can reach them at once. A telephone in your home is a real economy." So this is an advertisement making this argument that having a telephone will help you get a job during this economic downturn. There was also the release from any sort of stress that Columbus people might be feeling. You had all of the October brides in the society section. This was actually only for that week. There are brides in the society section every week. Every week in the Columbus newspapers. Lazarus clothing store was showing you the latest fashions, and so people could go through a newspaper and see pretty much normalcy. Next to an important article about the United States repression of free speech in Cuba is this giant map from AAA telling you how to get to the Ohio State football game on Saturday and showing you all of your traffic routes. So if you're new to the area, because you had just moved to Columbus, like a lot of people did, the front page of the newspaper gave you your priorities for the weekend. The next week, if you were headed to Northwestern for the Ohio State football game, we now have a 2-part map that shows you how to get from Columbus to Evanston, and then in the lower left-hand corner, when you're in Evanston, how to actually get to the stadium. Followed on the right by a Listerine ad in case you got a sore throat while at the football game. Okay, so even during the Great Depression, Columbus's priorities were very clear. Veterans living in Columbus in the 1930s also would have seen women voting. Women got the right to vote in 1920 and had been exercising it for a decade by the time the Great Depression rolled around, and so this was newsworthy and something that Columbus residents would have really, and veterans would have definitely been aware of. So Columbus veterans also participated during the Great Depression in return trips to France to see battlefields. This is one of the aspects that studying post-war America has continued to surprise me, that during this time of intense economic despair, tour groups were crossing the Atlantic regularly. I first heard of this when we started working on the Gold Star Mothers after World War I. The dates of these tours, I just could not reconcile with everything I knew about American history in terms of the Great Depression. Veterans went over to France, mothers went to find their sons' graves, politicians went to participate in ceremonies, journalists went. Clearly, an economic downturn in the United States was not enough to keep the war out of people's minds. When Columbus veterans traveled to Europe during these years, they went with a group called the Ohio Rainbow Division Veterans Association mostly. This group also hosted the annual state regimental reunions. And so, yes, of course, the Great Depression hit Columbus, and there was a need to help your neighbor. One of the newspapers that we have in our collection had this box every day that had this worksheet that you could cut out and send back to them. It was called Give a Job. And you could put your name and phone number and a little odd job that you needed done around your house, and then it would match up an unemployed resident with that job, right? So making connections in the community was clear that the newspapers were aware that these things needed to happen. But many veterans had pretty normal lives outside of this, and a lot of them were successful businessmen by this point, or were working for companies that recognized that Columbus really needed their labor in order to capitalize, again, on this sort of leap forward that World War I had created in Columbus. Historians often jump from the bonus march to the GI Bill, which we will get to, but there's an awful lot in between. During the New Deal, most veterans in Columbus were approaching middle age and beginning to assume leadership roles. And they still wanted, though, this military experience to draw them together. I do not get the sense that being a World War I veteran in Columbus was a defining marker of manhood for residents. There were plenty of social clubs and organizations for Columbus residents to enjoy if they had the money to do so. However, in 1939, 13 veterans formed the Last Man's Club of Franklin County to promote patriotism and good citizenship, is what they said. Okay, it's called the Last Man's Club. I am not sure why the American Legion, the VFW, or other organizations were not enough for these guys, but I have my suspicions that this group was actually an exclusive networking club of the who's who in Columbus society, and their designation of being a veteran was something that they wanted to hold them together, but they wanted to separate themselves from the VFW and the American Legion group. The reason we think this is because membership was limited to only 100 men, and each member had to be nominated by an existing member with a letter of recommendation explaining professional success. And then they had to go through an extensive vetting and interview process. And if you go to Ohio History Connection and you read the letters of nomination, it is very clear what they're aiming for. When a member died, their name was inscribed in this club's bugle, which was played at their funeral, and then the bugle was passed man to man until the last man died. And then it was donated to Ohio Historical Society. So veterans also joined together on the eve of the Second World War to remember their common bonds. It's interesting to me, though, that this organization was formed in 1939. We're 20 years past the end of World War I, and they're still saying to each other, like, hey, we were in the war together, and now we're doing pretty well in this community, let's hang out, and make it sort of about the war 20 years later. Perhaps we can argue that by 1939, some veterans wanted to separate from these notions of equality that had been the rhetoric of the time in 1919 and weren't so much by 1939. They may also, like I said, have succeeded in ways that their peers had not, and they wanted to create a community of like-minded veterans. Either way, World War I veterans across Columbus viewed the outbreak of the new war and the conflict in Europe with frustration, and they kept a close eye on developments. Okay, I forgot to put this slide in the slideshow, but I wanted to read you. In 1930, there's a headline in a newspaper in Columbus. It has a picture of Hitler, okay? And it says, "House painter is threatening Europe's peace." House painter, that's what they called him. This house painter is threatening Europe's peace, because that's all they knew about him at that point. Adolf Hitler, Germany's man of fire, borrows Mussolini's ideas. That's the headline at that point. But they were following it. They were very concerned, and as the United States moves more and more into war, one of the most important things that Congress begins to take stock of is what will we do with all of these World War II veterans that now we're going to have to deal with after the war. It was clear as Congress began discussions about World War II veterans that the experience of World War I veterans were going to be needed to inform their decision. These conversations were grounded in fear over veterans' unemployment, which is understandable considering we were just coming out of a depression. Also grounded in fear about the militancy of veteran politics after World War I. There was also a strong belief that federal policies for Great War veterans had simply just been wrong. So in 1944, the federal legislature passed the Servicemen Readjustment Act, which is also called the GI Bill, which became the largest social welfare program in the history of the country. The GI Bill came to life during a time when American political leaders were seriously considering an expansion of liberalism more in line with European-style social welfare provisioning for all citizens. So this was the culmination, if you will, of a speech FDR gave to the American Legion in 1933 when he told veterans they were not exceptional and did not deserve special benefits. He didn't say this, though, to say the government owed them nothing. What he meant instead was that the government owed everyone something, right? A guarantee of basic security. And so he didn't want veterans to be exceptional. However, this in his mind and in the mind of Congress by 1944 was a test of whether programs like this would be possible. A hand up, not a hand out. Through this program, veterans had access to college education or vocational training. We've heard that, but this was for every veteran, not just disabled ones. They also had unemployment insurance for up to a year. That's new. And they had access to capital to buy homes, start farms, start a business. So they had access to different things to help them sort of move forward. Of the 16 million veterans in total, about 78% of veterans benefited directly from the provisions of this bill. And it stimulated economic growth and development on an unprecedented scale, although historians also convincingly argue that it drove segregation and housing inequality and 100 other things that were not anticipated but probably negative results of the GI Bill. However, at a moment when World War I veterans were about to be overshadowed by World War II veterans, they made sure, through their activism and their leadership, that the younger generation had more of a hand up than they had had. After World War I, all veterans organizations began to wage the battle over attracting World War II veterans, and so their efforts on behalf of World War I veterans were eclipsed. Americans were obsessed with World War I. They were, I promise you. We just don't know it because then World War II came along. There was less to debate about World War I, less loss, less visible impact. We were not in the First War as long, and our motivations for joining it were not as clear. Oftentimes, World War I is only portrayed as this unfinished business that caused the Second World War. And so World War II has supplanted World War I in our memories. And in Columbus, we only have a handful of markers to speak of. Our most notable World War I monuments are missing, or they are in storage, which I can talk about in Q&A if you'd like. But our memory of World War I veterans in Columbus and nationally should be their connection to the GI Bill. And as I will posit here tonight, the group that often goes missing in the narrative arc about pensions between Civil War veterans and World War II veterans. Their role, though, was crucial, and its economic rewards shaped Columbus as it headed into the major growth era of the late 20th century. I want to leave you with something from the Central Ohio American Legion from 1959. This is called The American Legion, Do We Still Need It? Quote, "You ask me, is there a need for the American Legion? As long as there shall be one disabled veteran, there is the need for the American Legion. As long as there shall be one sightless eye, one shattered limb, one twisted back, one blanked mind unattended, there is need for the American Legion. As long as there shall be one comrade with or without means, one comrade's child without education, one comrade's grave unmarked, there is need for the American Legion. And remember this, you who serve the Legion will never be repaid in money, in additional hours, nor in added strength for the time and effort and money you expend for the American Legion. Instead, you will sleep well of nights, content and satisfied that in some way you have contributed to the comfort of your comrades and to the safety of your flag. You will come to know the lasting sweetness of comradeship, of true and unselfish friendship, and greater recompense than that comes not to any man." 40 years and another world war after Columbus's soldiers came home from Europe, they were still thinking about their own legacy to this region, to the state, and to the nation. Their needs may have been pushed aside by the larger veteran population of World War II, and I would argue that the legacy of what they left behind in terms of activism and leadership and work ethic that ultimately took the form of the GI Bill was the most important aspect of their service to the nation. Overall, we do not as a society commemorate their work enough. We do not hold them in high esteem in the same ways we debate, consider, and revere soldiers from other generations. But it is clear that these veterans, World War I veterans, became a part of the fabric of Columbus and succeeded in moving it forward despite any slight they may have felt. And perhaps their retreat into the more silent folds of our nation's history speaks more about their sacrifice than what they did on the battlefields. I'd like to invite you to join me in further discussion at the Columbus Historical Society. While I have the stage, I'm going to show you a few things. This is the mural on the left that is painted on the Battery B apartment complex in Italian Village to honor the World War I veterans of Jeffrey Company. That mural was put by a developer who hired an artist to do it, and we used it as the backdrop of our advertisement for our exhibits. Our exhibits are open on Sundays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, And if you come, we have a replica of the Memorial Arch, which is shown on the right, that one of our board of trustees members built from scratch. And it's very impressive, and the exhibits are wonderful. I really do hope that you'll make it out. And I say this because they close April 30th. So please plan on a Sunday, Tuesday, or Friday between now and April 30th to come down to Columbus and visit us. We also have 3 upcoming events I'd like to mention. One is a Central Ohio Historical Society's Night Out, free tours featuring myself and another curator tomorrow evening. This is tomorrow from 6 to 8 p.m. We do not normally have evening hours during the week, so if this is a time that's convenient for you, I will be there. And then on May 9th, we're featuring a tour of Camp Chase and a book talk by Dr. Angela Zombeck, who I actually went to grad school with. And she wrote this book on military prisons. Oh, I did the index for that book too. So she's going to come talk about her book and give us a tour of Camp Chase on May 9th, if you can join us. And on May 21st, Julie Powell, who's a Ph.D. candidate at Ohio State, will talk about World War I veteran rehabilitation. So I hope that all of you will join us at the Columbus Historical Society for an event or the exhibits. Thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished lecture series. It really is an honor, and I'd like to open the floor up now for questions. Thank you.
It sounds to me like the pension plan for Civil War veterans and World War I veterans, they were both backwards. They were based on service and sacrifice that the men had made while they were in the military. And it sounds like, by contrast, one of the ideas about the GI Bill after World War II is it's very forward-looking. It's not only how can we help these men adjust to society, but how can we put them on a path to get a college education or start a business or purchase a farm. Would that sort of be accurate in your sense of thinking about those 3 plans?
I think that would be entirely accurate, and it jives with everything we did after World War II as compared to World War I. Right after World War I, we retreated within ourselves. We put forth isolationism. We didn't want to have anything to do with Europe. After World War II, we had the Marshall Plan. We went out. We realized that in order to prevent further conflict, you have to create an environment for success. So we did that with the GI Bill, the Marshall Plan, the UN. You know, there's so many ways in which the United States finally accepted its role and agreed to move forward after World War II in ways that they hadn't after the Civil War with Reconstruction, or after World War I when they retreated from Europe and left them to fall apart. So I agree. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to come to the back here.
I just want to say that Dr. Tootle from Ohio State left. He just ran out because he told me he wasn't going to stay past the tip-off of the basketball game.
Well, but the Buckeyes aren't playing.
I know, that's what I said. I'm not even using that. But I said to him last night when he told me that they're not, it's okay. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Thank you very much. So it's really, really interesting. So you mentioned that, and of course I agree that the cause of fighting in the Civil War and in World War II were clearer than in World War I. And you've mentioned Jeffrey Manufacturing and Buckeye Steel. I'm curious, this is the, how much money did they make in wartime contracts with the national government? Both of them. And so I'm not saying that they did this callously. You know, it's good for us to send some of our employees off to fight and welcome them back. You know, human beings have mixed motives. But did both of those companies, if you know, have significant wartime contracts so that, you know, the war was economically in their interest?
Agreed. Hold on, I'm trying to find this one thing I wanted to read you, but I probably won't be able to find it. So, concerns about business capitalizing on World War I was absolutely a reason why people did not support it. So I do agree with you wholeheartedly that that these companies made a lot of money, and that is probably what led them to move forward in some respects. That was something that politicians who did not agree with the war criticized and called them out for. But that isn't something that I have done enough research and able to be able to answer the exact dollar amount.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean literally money. Do you know if they had, who were the wartime contracts?
Assuredly they did. And this particular conflict pushed both of those companies and many other into new levels of industrialization that they hadn't had before. And a lot of that was driven by like the access to labor also that the war brought in. So I definitely, and that's something that I should think about. Mm-hmm.
Here, Ezra, I'll bring it there.
I wonder if you had done the study of Cleveland or Cincinnati, whether you would have found anything different. I mean, Cleveland, in a way, was getting through being an industrial city. And my thought as to why Columbus has grown so much is it became the service center for insurance and commerce and all kinds of things. So as we moved to the service sector, the industrial part in Cleveland was no longer as prominent. Was there any difference between Columbus and other cities as to the reaction to World War I?
Sure. So I think that two things that are important to point out are that both Cleveland and Cincinnati, but much more so Cleveland, had a larger influx of African Americans. And so that transition for blacks after the war was much more difficult in Cleveland than in Columbus. More attention, more job replacement, losing their jobs. The 1920s movement of suburbia, the white flight out of cities, segregated and caused ghettos in Cleveland in ways that we didn't see in Columbus. I would also, as a native Clevelander, have to argue that part of the reason why Columbus grew so fast and Cleveland didn't was annexation that Columbus undertook of outside areas where Cleveland's metropolitan area is much smaller because communities siphoned themselves off into other cities, right? Whereas Columbus kept growing its footprint and then calling that growth. I'll cease to be as defensive about that. And then Cincinnati, they had a tremendous amount, much more of the German tension. So their issue during World War I, that again we didn't see in Columbus, was that there was a lot of conflict between Protestant, white, native Cincinnati residents and German American residents of Cincinnati. That caused tension that lingered into the 1920s more than what Columbus ever had to deal with. And so both of those issues, and I agree with you, Columbus did turn towards the service sector while Cleveland and Cincinnati did not, but they just were dealing with different social problems than Columbus was. Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to ask one more question based on the photograph you have up there.
Yep.
So, did Malcolm Jeffrey and Walter Jeffrey, were they simply commissioned as officers because they happened to be the son of a very prominent industrialist in Columbus? How exactly did one get to become an officer in World War I?
If you had a college education, you could become an officer. So for the most part, that's how most officers were selected, was because they knew someone, they were appointed, they were college educated, and so I think that they organized the regiment. And so also if you showed up at the enlistment office and you said, here's myself and 400 guys, then you were the officer for that regiment.
So that's very similar to the 19th century, then,
Yes.
the Civil War, where if you showed up with a bunch of men,
Right.
you could be the major and
Right.
command it.
Right. Yep.
Well, before we thank our speaker, I would like to remind everyone here, if you're not already on the History Department email list and you would like to get information about future Vogel lectures, please put your name on the sheet in the back. Dawn would very much appreciate that. Thank you for coming, and let's give one more round of applause to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much.